Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Eric Belsky. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies and want to welcome you to the Graduate School of Design this evening. Obviously here for a terrific presentation by a world-renowned scholar on the history of the American landscape with a special focus on suburbs, Dolores Hayden. It's a little bit of a homecoming, of course, for Dolores, who is an alum of the GSD, and so we always like to take credit for our illustrative alumni, so I want to underscore that. And we were talking just before her presentation starts about her time here, and this building was just starting to get up and running as she was graduating, so she's refamiliarizing herself with the new digs. And it's just, as I say, wonderful to have her. The topic she's going to speak about tonight is something that she's been writing about for a number of years and is considered a leading authority on, which is suburbs as an urban form, and has been working in this area a lot, and started as being one of the pioneers in thinking about suburbs and its relationship to gender relations in society and redesigning the American dream. Has gone on to write a lot of books just trying to comprehend this thing we call the suburbs where so many people live. And tonight she's going to talk about her view of how to think about suburbs. So really taking a step back and saying, you know, does this concept have content? Does it have valuable content? If it does, it certainly isn't going to have that content if you just label everything that isn't part of some very dense original core suburbs. So she's going to, I think, also breathe fresh life for many people who haven't focused on this issue into how to think about these spaces that make them compelling in terms of how you think about them for policy and for planning. I am going to turn the podium over now to my friend and colleague Ann Forsythe, who's a professor of urban planning here at the Graduate School of Design and is a faculty advisor to the Joint Center for Housing Studies, because she knows Dolores personally, and I always like to be able to have someone who can make a personal introduction. For me, this is just an enormous treat because I've been reading Dolores' work, for many years and never had an opportunity to meet her. So I'm a little bit like a kid in a candy store for this particular presentation. But I thought I'd, again, turn it over to Ann, who knows her well, to give a more personal introduction.
Well, I must admit, Eric's given a very comprehensive introduction, so I'll add where I can. It's really a pleasure to introduce Dolores Hayden, who's the Professor of Architecture, Urbanism, and American Studies at Yale, having also taught at MIT Berkeley and UCLA, where I met her, although I actually never did a whole class with Dolores because she was off having her daughter Laura when I arrived. Dolores, as you know, is author of 6 books exploring the relation of people to place, from 7 American Utopias of 1976 and Redesigning the American Dream of 1984 through Building Suburbia, published in 2003, and a field guide to sprawl next year. She's also founder of the Power of Place, a nonprofit that celebrated the history of ethnically diverse Los Angeles and culminated in a book. What you may not know is she's also a published poet who's won awards for her poetry, both in book and periodical formats. She's won a lot of awards, including an American Library Association Notable Book Award, as well as awards from the Association Collegiate Schools of Planning. And when I actually nominated her for award from ACSP a few years ago, it was just very clear that she had made a huge contribution both to planning scholarship and to the lives of planning scholars, helping numerous people become part of the Planning Academy and the Urban History Academy, the Architecture Academy, working across a number of disciplines to really build a community of scholars as well as a body of scholarship. Importantly for this talk and for that sort of part of her history, in 2010 she was president of the Urban History Association of about 500 scholars working on urban and suburban history, and in doing that sort of continued the work that she's been doing for years, helping to integrate the urban and suburban, as well as dealing with people from a variety of fields within the urban history format. She's been a fellow, likewise she's been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and in 2009 organized a week-long faculty seminar their own research in the built environment that brought together participants from a variety of fields. This kind of work to try and create scholarship and create a body of scholars is very important. Overall, Dolores has been a really powerful advocate for better understanding the relation of diverse kinds of people to diverse kinds of places, and we really welcome her to the GSD.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Anne, for such warm welcome and such wonderful introductions. My topic tonight, Borderlands, Build-Outs, Big Boxes with a question mark, the shaping of American suburban landscapes, 1820 to 2000. Most Americans today inhabit complex metropolitan landscapes that are layered with suburban tracts, strips, malls, office parks, highways. Few can fully decode their physical shapes or explain their economic origins. Half a century ago, most Americans were confident they knew the meanings of the words city, suburb, and countryside, but current metropolitan landscapes often defy those older terms. The census defines suburbs as, quote, the non-central city parts of metropolitan areas, unquote, a negative definition. Tonight, I'd like to propose to you some more nuanced ways to name and identify suburban places. And I think we'll have some time for questions and debate at the end because many of these issues are still very controversial. I am an urban landscape historian. My works included large cities and small towns as well as suburbs. And by landscape history, I mean what geographers would call the history of the cultural landscape, the combination of natural and built elements that will define the character of a place. I studied what's been built, and I also study how the built environment has been represented and imagined in art, literature, popular culture. I study how it's been experienced by diverse inhabitants, not just people who might have been readers of the New Yorker, but here we have some African-American children in a suburb in 1941 outside of Detroit, and they are next to a wall, which is, let me go back to say, but I get the camera working. The wall is separating a self-built African-American neighborhood from a white subdivision, which is on the other side, and this is half a mile long. So there are complex processes about how space is financed, planned, designed, and built. And they range across many significant stages of construction. I try to study many of those different stages, although probably what is the heart of my expertise is really looking at how the built environment frames everyday life. And here we've got a greenfield subdivision in New Jersey, and you can see the trace of a farm up there in the corner. I look at what activities the built environment will support or constrain. And when I'm doing my research, I'm looking at archival materials on vernacular buildings and town plans. I'm looking at historic and contemporary photographs, and I'm also out there doing field work on buildings and landscapes. I often use physical evidence to engage with large cultural and political questions, and so those are the kinds of questions that are often tackled by scholars in American studies, who are my colleagues in part of my appointment at Yale. I'm also in the School of Architecture. So I think Anne and Eric told you about my redesigning the American Dream and building suburbia, 2 books about suburbs. The first one critiqued suburbs of the 1950s as promoting what I called an architecture of gender, tract housing that was designed for a male homeowner and a female housewife, and might turn out to be quite inappropriate as more and more women entered the paid labor force and were earning as well as nurturing. Building suburbia traces suburban history over a longer period of time. I begin with 1820 and moved up to 2000, and building suburbia was a research project funded by many authors, including the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the Graham Foundation. It turned out that I had a grant to do some aerial photography to try to understand the later stages of suburban development and the scale of it. And I worked with first Alex McKean and then Jim Wark. And another book came out of that same research project called A Field Guide to Sprawl, which used the aerial photography to create a dictionary of bad building patterns and the subsidies behind them. And here is some of the language that's explained in that dictionary. Some of it's planning jargon, some of it's real estate jargon, some of it's invented by journalists. But tonight I want to focus on the argument of building suburbia, which is that Americans have created 7 suburban landscapes since 1820. Here's the list: Borderlands, picturesque enclaves, streetcar build-outs, mail-order and self-built suburbs, sitcom suburbs, edge nodes, and rural fringes. And I'm going to argue that those 7 landscapes can be divided into 2 eras of construction: 4 before and 3 after federal subsidies for residential, commercial, and highway building. These 3 books on suburbs have been written for the general reader, and they were all published by trade publishers, Norton and Pantheon. Now, there's new jargon that appears about suburbs all the time. Words like exurb, rhubarb, technoburb, edgeless city, boomburb, galactic metropolis. But in writing Building Suburbia, I kept my language as clear as possible because I was writing for the general reader. I was writing for people who wanted to understand the history of their own communities and people who wanted to be able to go to local community meetings and speak up about the state of architecture and planning in their own communities. Field Guide to Sprawl discusses some planning jargon and real estate jargon and simplifies it, but in Building Suburbia, I tried to stick to some clear ways of labeling these areas of suburban development rather than inventing clever new terms to describe years of development. Now, as you all know, I'm sure, today, the majority of Americans live in the suburban areas of metropolitan regions. Back in 1910, only 7% of Americans lived in suburbs. By 1970, more Americans lived in suburbs than either the centers of cities or rural areas. And by 2010, suburban residents were 51% of the population, outnumbering residents in the centers of cities and rural areas combined. So this is our national pattern. There are hundreds of excellent books and articles that have been written about specific suburbs, but relatively few attempts have been made to write the history of suburban America across time. Many of those earlier histories relied on the history of transportation, described things as railroad suburbs, streetcar suburbs, or automobile suburbs, and they focused on male commuting, generally the commute of a middle-class white male. And some of them focused on the architectural history of a few planned suburban towns. Well, those were all significant issues, but as I worked on this book, I decided I had to frame the story around a broader population. That population would include men, women, and children of every class and race. And I tried also to move away from accounts of suburbia that were about residents as consumers of housing, consumers of other kinds of goods related to the house and the yard, and instead try to push towards looking at the expansion of residential and commercial construction as the production of space. I looked at ordinary building types and unplanned growth, as well as places that were designed and planned by professionals. Now, many of you probably had a text for your high school U.S. history course, maybe AP U.S. history we would say. Suburbs in the United States arose in the post-World War II era. There were easy mortgages, ubiquitous automobiles, and white-collar and blue-collar workers of diverse ethnic backgrounds settled their wives and children in suburban tract houses outside city centers, and everyone became what was called middle class. I wanted to complicate that kind of suburban history, and certainly right now I would stress to you that most of those mortgages were for white male workers, so it was an era of real racial segregation and gender segregation that appeared after World War II. But today the demographics of suburban households look very different. And that white male breadwinner family with the stay-at-home mom and the 2 kids in the peaceful 3-bedroom colonial with the leafy yard and the sociable neighbors is something you will find mainly in reruns of old sitcoms like Father Knows Best. In the year 2000, singles became the predominant household type in American suburbs, outnumbering married couples with children. Those singles were either young people or elderly people living alone. And by 2010, suburbs were over 1/3 white. For the first time, over half of every major racial and ethnic group in the United States lived in suburbs. And so did half of all new immigrants who were born elsewhere. So this is a very complicated picture. Taking the long view in building suburbia, I tried to look at both consumption and production, understanding that the residents of suburbs across time had looked for what I called a triple dream. They looked for affordable housing, closeness to nature, and a sense of community. But the producers of suburban real estate always had very different goals from the residents. They were looking for growth in the sale of residential and commercial real estate. And so one phrase that seemed very useful was that of the growth machine, a term that sociologist Harvey Mollick coined in 1976 and also used in his book Urban Fortunes in 1987 with John Logan, explaining the pro-growth activities of not an urban growth machine but a suburban growth machine would require looking at land speculators, builders, bankers, realtors, trade associations, and all of their allies who were in elected or appointed government positions. And by focusing on the development process, it gave me a way to analyze the disappointment that much suburban development has evoked. I didn't have to attack suburbs in general. I didn't want to blame residents who'd chosen to live in suburbs. It gave me a way to talk about what kinds of conflicts and what kinds of disappointments these eras of suburban development had produced. And ultimately, my book, Building Suburbia, really revolved around 2 centuries of conflict between residents who were hoping to enjoy their neighborhoods and developers who were often pushing to increase the scale and speed of growth in any given neighborhood, and who were thinking not only about residential building, but also about commercial and industrial projects. And those industrial and commercial uses are there often from the very beginning of suburbanization. So let's turn to look at these 7 landscapes. Many of them, when you're in a given town, may be a little bit hard to see as physically distinct. There are often fragments and overlays and collisions and erasures of more than one pattern in a given place. Suburban growth has been constant across political boundaries, and those political boundaries themselves are often confusing. Sometimes it's also hard to see these patterns chronologically. 4 of the ones that I will describe, the picturesque enclaves, the sitcom suburbs, the H nodes, and the rural fringes, continue to be constructed right up to this present moment. So the Borderlands. We're heading back to the early part of the 19th century. Here is Nathaniel Parker Willis's view of New York, seen from Weehawken, New Jersey in 1840. It's in a book called American Scenery. The image contains many elements of suburban life. Back here in Manhattan, still fairly small place. The tallest structures are the steeples of churches and then occasionally the mast of a ship. And on this leafy shore in New Jersey, you can see some very early commuters who are lining up here on a pier to get on the sailboat. So to form these earliest suburban landscapes between about 1820 and 1850, Borderlands entrepreneurs courted one middle-class family at a time. They might be farmers, they might be ferry boat owners. They sold existing farmhouses at lots. And beginning in the 1840s, families, middle-class families who wished to go and live in the suburbs often carried manuals with them or how-to books. Two of the most popular authors were Andrew Jackson Downing and Catherine Beecher. Downing, in his treatise Landscape Gardening, told people how to buy a farm and convert the farmhouse to a country estate. Here's the basic farm up top, and here's the more elaborate roofscape and the winding drive and the extra landscaping. And he gave you more detailed instructions. Here's the plat of the common farm, and here's that farm improved as a country estate with a house and a winding drive and picturesque planting, an orchard, and a kitchen garden. Catherine Beecher and Downing were both writing in a Christian framework, and they were writing about piety and family values connected to these suburban places. Here we have the title page of Catherine Beecher's American Woman's Home. Women gathered with their children, the suburban house shown in the middle. She also has pictures of suburban houses with crosses on the gables because she sees it as the home church of Jesus Christ, where women will earn salvation by doing all their own housework and raising 10 children in a leafy and pleasant atmosphere. The husband for Catherine Beecher is meant to head into the city to battle with the ups and downs of capitalism, boom and bust, while a woman maintains a stable home in a suburban place. And at that time, there were women certainly who complained of Lonelyville and didn't like the suburbs. Here we have gender in the borderland. She's told to find satisfaction in domestic tasks, and men in the borderland are told to take up the lawnmower, which is invented in the 1860s, and here's an ad from the 1870s, and find a way to develop the yard along with the house. Now, in many ways, the borderland sets the cultural context for things that go on for an extremely long time. And the borderland is a place that many of these pieces of prescriptive literature idealize, but no one could deal with the main problem in the borderland, which was how to halt the advance of urban development. So as many people took up the ideal of suburban living, one family at a time, they were also dealing with all those other uses that might be out there on the periphery of the city, tanneries, unwanted industries that needed more space than the city allowed, and sometimes things like religious revivals. The borderland was never a common, easy place, and there were also, of course, all the farmers. And John Stilgoe's book Borderland described this very well, how the farmers had one way of thinking about peaceful life in the country, and these middle-class residents who headed to the borderland often found that they didn't care for the sights and sounds and smells of working farms right next to them. So what comes next? Picturesque enclaves are organized by developers and sometimes landscape architects and architects who want to create a greater sense of community and control the design of suburbs in a way that they believe will be more effective than just having one family at a time move to a suburban place. One of the precedents for the picturesque enclaves was what was called the Villa Park in England. And yet, interestingly, another precedent, and maybe a stronger precedent, was the number of American communitarians who had founded towns in the 1840s and 1850s, hoping to create socialist communities. The Shakers, the followers of Charles Fourier, for example, were very involved with building community and defining community architecturally. And A.J. Davis, who was the architect at Llewellyn Park in New Jersey in 1857, actually had a simultaneous commission to design a community for the followers of Charles Fourier only 5 miles from Llewellyn Park. And at Llewellyn Park, 50 wealthy families came together. The landscaping was in the picturesque style. Lots might be as large as 50 acres or as small as 5 acres. The houses were eclectic. Here's a typical Gothic revival example. And they had a community park. And in that community park, they celebrated May Day with hundreds of people here in the 1860s. The sense of the picturesque enclave as an ideal community was heavily publicized. Journalists attended events like this. And pretty soon, many, many affluent people wanted to live in some kind of a picturesque enclave. This was a gated community. And many of these enclave communities that followed it tended to be gated. For example, as an extreme example, Tuxedo Park, New York, designed by Bruce Price in 1886, had a fence 8 feet high. It was 24 miles long and completely surrounded the community. And then people who had estates within this gated community had private gates, like this one, inside that larger wall. Many of these enclaves were also designed with deed restrictions. Olmsted's firm did Riverside, Illinois with some, then Palos Verdes, California. J.C. Nichols did the Country Club District in Kansas City, and right here on the billboard you see 1,000 acres restricted. It meant no billboards, and it also meant no African Americans. Palos Verdes, California was in the Spanish colonial revival style, but they didn't want anyone of Mexican ancestry. That was also part of their deed restriction. Robert Fishman, historian, has called communities like this bourgeois utopias, separated from industrial cities that often generated the owner's wealth. One of the most positive things you can say about the picturesque enclaves is that the residents took very good care of their natural landscapes and shared parkland within them, certainly at the beginning. Over time, however, those shared community parks often tended to become things like golf clubs, country clubs, or other sports facilities. The fashion, though, for talking about suburbanization had been part of the nation's excitement from the 1870s on, and at the same time the picturesque enclaves were gaining strength. The suburb was mass-produced as what one developer called the working man's reward. The Streetcar Build-Outs, or what Sam Warner in his wonderful book called Streetcar Suburbs, dealing with those communities south of Boston. The streetcar build-outs between 1870 and 1920 were organized by large subdividers of land. They developed thousands of lots. They often worked in partnership with urban transit owners and city governments. And in that situation, since some transit was privately owned, kickbacks and bribes were common. But after the subdivision of lots, in many places there were hundreds of small local builders constructing houses. They might be single family, they might be duplexes, and here in this slide in New Haven, and also in a slide from Sam Warner's book with the triple decker, the 3-family house predominated. In other parts of the country, in the Midwest and the West, you may see more single-family bungalows. These were very densely built up neighborhoods. They encouraged 3-generation families to live together. The parents, the children, the grandparents, all in one place. Often, the women in these streetcar suburbs took in boarders or laundry. They raised chickens, they grew food. They were much more tied to practical work and income than anybody living in one of those picturesque enclaves. In some cases, the advertising for these streetcar suburbs was quite over the top. Samuel Gross in Chicago was a major developer. Here's a little pamphlet that he liked to hand out at factory gates, and you notice how all these little bungalows are surrounded by greenery. But of course he built in neighborhoods that were much more filled in than this. He also, in addition to subdividing, he did build houses, and he also provided mortgages. He was a huge booster of places, and he didn't hesitate to name things after himself. He ran excursion trains, and here you see the train puffing out to Grossdale with polka bands sitting on the top of the train playing music, and then people would come to a tent. It was like a revival. There'd be free beer, music, and auctioneers talking lots. And this was also typical of many land sales in the West. Here we have one in California in 1913, and barbecues were the thing out in the West. So here are people about to enjoy some very serious beef. So the excitement, the hype, is something that continues into later eras. And also in these early times, foreclosures were frequent. But these developments extended many urban centers, doubled and tripled them in size, and not all streetcar suburbs were working class. In Chevy Chase, Maryland, a couple of senators developed a streetcar suburb in the 1890s, which was distinctly upper class, more like the enclaves. In fact, it had hunting, riding, and a polo club. So, what comes next? More expansion of suburban living for ordinary people with the mail order and self-built suburbs. And I hesitated a long time about whether categories 3 and 4 went together, the streetcars, the mail order, and self-built, or whether they were separate. But I made mail order and self-built suburbs separate because there are changes in the way that construction happens. People are still buying lots from large subdividers, but there's the factory production of mail order houses, and that changes the construction process because people can get the parts for tens of thousands. They get tens of thousands of parts, maybe 40,000 parts for a pre-cut or ready-cut house, shipped to them by rail or by truck. And here in LA, the parts are going out on a truck about 1910. Do-it-yourself becomes an advertisement. Cheaper to buy than already built is one of the slogans, which you see down here. And I'm sure they also have something about getting rid of your rent receipts, which was an argument very popular with Samuel Gross in the earlier era. But making the house come together yourself became a little bit of a bad joke. There's a Buster Keaton movie called 1 Week, which shows a honeymoon couple trying to put their house together in 7 days. And once you see that, you know this is a terrible idea. It can't always be done. People often haven't estimated all of the costs for electrical or plumbing. They bought a kit, but their own skills are a little bit behind. And so there's something called a garage suburb, and that's inhabited by somebody who finishes the garage but is unable to finish the house. Now, Sears houses are popular in this mail order era, and here's one called a Nantucket. And they look a little bit familiar to you. Just remember this one because I'm going to show you what happens to this particular plan in a later era. The people who are doing the mail order in self-built suburbs, now some of them are what are called curbstoners. This is a curbstoner is a person selling lots who doesn't have an office other than sitting on the edge of the sidewalk. They sit on the curbstone, literally. And here's a woman selling lots in Detroit in 1941 for $250. But by 1908, there is a national lobby representing the larger subdividers called the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges. It later becomes the National Association of Real Estate Bureaus, and then finally National Association of Realtors. This is a very, very major trade organization. By the mid-1920s, it's gone national. It leads a campaign to make mortgage interest deductible from federal income tax. It helps to draft national models for zoning and building codes. It assists Herbert Hoover in his conference on home building and home ownership. I think that's 1931. And its members helped draft the FHA legislation, which is eventually passed under Roosevelt in '34. And that ensures mortgages for what turned out to be segregated private suburban developments in the next era. But it is in the self-built and mail order era that promoting national growth by selling houses becomes a very popular idea. So next up, the sitcom suburbs. These I actually named. And I named them because the sitcom suburbs extend the range of suburban development, and the FHA legislation minimizes equity investment for big developers, it lowers financial risks, creates incentive for larger and larger corporations to plan subdivisions that are at an urban scale, and they're constructing every house. By the late 1940s, the largest subdivisions like Levittown or Lakewood, California, reach a scale of 50 to 80,000 people. But there's very little appropriate infrastructure, such as town centers or sewers, in this first Levittown. And places like this first Levittown are composed of little houses, 800 square foot houses, that are very similar to the Sears Nantucket. They do interview a couple of contemporary architects at the time, like Neutra, but they decide they're going to go with the tried and true favorite house from the mail order time. And so these are a couple of variations on that basic so-called Cape Cod bungalow. The striking thing about these communities is that they're almost always very, very segregated because of mortgage discrimination. And I guess we could also add that almost everyone has a television. In Levittown, they actually build them into the stairwell. There are TV ads for appliances, which are cross-marketing with Levitt and the housing business. And then there are film promotions in this era, too. Mr. Blandings builds his dream house, a famous film from the late 1940s. And the real estate people do a promotion where they build 70 of these Mr. Blandings houses in suburban communities around the country. And they advertise that the local developers will sell the dream house for less than Mr. Blandings paid in the movie. People line up for this, and it increases the hype. The national production of suburban houses in the 50s is $1 to $2 million, 1 to 2 million houses a year, and statistics about new construction become indicators of national economic health. And because of the mortgage subsidy, the smallest houses can get expanded over time, and then the new houses, this is Hamden, Connecticut in the 50s, and the new houses are constantly getting larger and larger. So if those early ones were 800 square feet, by the 1970s they're 1,600 square feet, and 20 years after that, they're likely to be over 2,000. Now, this is because your mortgage subsidy gets bigger as your house gets more expensive. As your mortgage is bigger, you have paying more interest, so you get to subtract that from your income tax. And all of this expansion of size goes on, even though household sizes are starting to shrink. Still, there comes a moment when there's political concern that perhaps the demand for new residential construction might be declining. And so, the edge node is developed. Starting in 1954, there are federal tax breaks for accelerated depreciation for commercial developers who are building in greenfield places. That is beyond existing suburbs. And the key building type here is the shopping mall. And the key location for an edge node is going to be at the intersection of multiple arterials and highways. Here's a traffic diagram for a mall in New Jersey. There is another typical mall with lots of space left around it for more development. That's a contemporary picture. So this happens before the 1956 federal funding for the construction of interstate highways. But we start to see big boxes, and then collections of big boxes, and in addition, things like motels, fast food, and office parks that are all in these edge nodes and partaking of some of these tax breaks. It stimulates commercial growth on a scale that some of those earlier house builders never, ever would have imagined. And here's one of my favorite examples, Tyson's Corner, 1935. It's actually a corner store with a gas station. And Tyson's Corner, 1989, multiple malls, office parks, fast food, and every possible kind of commercial use, all scattered in that landscape with loads of parking. What's happening then with the edge nodes is that there are more and more people working in suburban places. Fewer and fewer jobs are in downtowns, older city centers, and more being scattered around metropolitan areas. But the people who work in a place like Tyson's Corner, for the most part, don't want to live in something that has such a tremendous amount of traffic and, very little charm. And so, perhaps, if the edge nodes start to be consolidated, well, they're launched in '54, then maybe consolidated in the '60s, they get named a little bit later. The next thing that happens is that many Americans move themselves to the rural fringes. And the rural fringes are the places that you can get to. If you jump in the car at the edge node at the end of the workday, and you drive as fast as you can to a place that you think has charm and character. And so those edge nodes may be unspoiled, quote-unquote, places. They may be subdivisions on the outskirts of older small towns, and they may be tract mansions and farmers' fields. This is an aerial view of Connecticut. And the rural amenities, and this is interesting too, I mean, you can see not only the farmers' fields, but also there's an old small cemetery in there. And meanwhile, everybody's thinking about how big the house can be, or whether they're having a swimming pool or a tennis court. Rural amenities also might include horses. Here's a gated community in a rural fringe area, and the horses are on the upper left. So, the rural fringe can also appeal to people who will be able to telecommute. And sometimes the rural fringe contains second homes as well as main homes, although this is just like what happened in the Borderlands. There's a perpetual search for the unspoiled suburban place, and we're back to some of the problems of landscape one. The constant advance of urban scale development means that the fringe is never a stable place, because more and more people are always looking for the unspoiled landscape. So, as I've said, I conclude in Building Suburbia that the real story is contestation between the residents who are looking for housing, connection to nature, and a sense of community, and those who wish to profit from extending new construction. I believe that often residents don't know the complex history of their own communities. I'd love to see better public history about suburbs in every suburban town. And I think it's also important for people who are designers to have a little bit more sense of suburban history in case you want to repair suburban landscapes. And there's one example of a successful project of this kind. Irvington, New York is a Hudson River suburb. It was originally a borderland area, and this building was a factory that built greenhouses for people's estates. Ultimately, it was abandoned, although it was a derelict building across from a railroad station and 1 block from the main street of this town. Stephen Tilley was the architect, and the developers Jonathan Rose. They took that abandoned building and they made it into 22 units of affordable housing and added on the ground floor a new space for the town's public library. And so they did a number of excellent things here. They provided mixed use. They created housing that was within walking distance of the railroad station and the main street. And they thought about jobs housing balance because they allocated many of those units to teachers and firefighters who worked for the town but couldn't afford to live there. Well, let me wrap up by saying a little bit more about issues of sprawl. And this is an example of a repair, but often people really shake their heads about how you can enter some of those edge node communities or even sitcom suburbs or rural fringes and think about doing a repair. It's really impossible to frame urban problems without accounting for suburban growth. And many planners and environmentalists would define sprawl as a process of development that results in low-density, scattered, discontinuous, automobile-oriented construction, usually on the periphery of a metropolitan region that also includes declining older suburbs and an aging downtown. In other words, this constant expansion comes at a terrific cost. And there's a contrast between affluent, private new growth, often with various sorts of subsidies behind it, and the decaying public infrastructure in older neighborhoods. That marks sprawl as socially destructive and often poor households, especially those headed by women and people of color, are the most vulnerable. Now, how did we get to the possibility of sprawl when people started out with so many small-scale dreams of a suburb that might be a combination of the virtues of city and country? Well, I would argue that suburbanization accelerated into sprawl in the late 40s when the federal government started subsidizing greenfield construction without much land use planning. The speed of the production of suburban landscapes had been increasing over a long period of time. The borderlands and enclaves relied on local capital. The streetcar build-outs and mail-order suburbs on regional capital. But something very different happened with the sitcom suburbs, the edge nodes, and the rural fringes, because so many federal subsidies boosted that production in greenfield areas without public transit. And one historian has described this as an era of compulsory automobility. Another has described it as the asphalt nation. But these last three places certainly are going to be very difficult to navigate without your own private car. The subsidies, I'm sure you know what they are. There's the income tax deduction for mortgage interest, which is also called a mansion subsidy. The FHA and VA mortgage insurance, the 1954 accelerated depreciation, 1956 federal funding for interstate highways. Increasingly, in addition to the federal subsidies, there started to be state and local subsidies. for things like regional malls in the name of economic growth. And thus, the nation with some suburbs, along with some small town cities and some countryside, moved towards being a nation of sprawling metropolitan regions between the mid-1940s and the present. There was always criticism, and by the 1950s the word sprawl was being used, although critics such as Louis Mumford or Jay Jacobs were more often attacking the banality of suburbs as mass culture than attacking the deployment of public dollars to subsidize private development projects. In that era of the 50s and 60s, many people deplored white flight, but they didn't make a critique of the federal mortgage policy behind it in every case. And there were also misogynist suburb bashers who blamed women for this. They claimed that the predominance of wives and mothers in suburban towns contributed to what one man called the, quote, unnatural, manless matriarchy during the daytime when the men were all in the city. This is part of a really wonderful project done by Laura Manville, who's a recent MIT planning director. So, there were also people who were running the numbers, and since the 1970s, social scientists creating a critique of the costs of sprawl, heavily quantitative literature in the beginning, lots of statistics about wasted land and wasted energy. And the more optimistic costs of sprawl authors suggested that if Americans only made better choices, the problem of growth would be solved. You could solve it with smart growth, you could solve it with better architecture from new urbanist designers. Underlying those arguments, there's the assumption that growth is driven by consumer decisions in the market. And so that argument doesn't really account for the decades of hidden subsidy real estate, banking, construction, and trucking interests, as well as the subsidies to individual homeowners who are predominantly white and male. Recently, there's also been literature contending there's no sprawl, no problem of sprawl. Writers such as David Brooks, a journalist, sketched the contented guy called Patio Man, who loved to get his stuff at the Walmart and take it home for a backyard barbecue. And architectural historian Robert Brugman suggested that cities have always grown outward, and there was really no reason to make a fuss about sprawl or overdevelopment. They both argued that sprawl equaled freedom and democracy, and they cited rising rates of homeownership to support their arguments. Well, of course, this is before the mortgage crash, after the rise of mortgage foreclosures, especially for people of color with subprime loans, when heard a little less about freedom and democracy at their patio. There's also been some good recent scholarship. David Freund's essay, Marketing the Free Market, and his book, Colored Property, he'll show how white male-headed families were encouraged to believe their residence was the happy result of their own efforts in the free market under capitalism and not the result of systematic race discrimination in lending. The one thing, though, that joins some of the authors of the right and the authors of the left is their lack of concern with severe mortgage discrimination against women of all races. And so there's more to be written on this subject. And let me just wrap up by saying that the green fields and suburban growth raise very important questions. Should public subsidies, often rooted in arcane tax codes and invisible to citizens, support private development? Or should taxpayers' funds support places, public places, and public uses? If Americans have created a dominant suburban culture over the last couple of centuries, we need to be able to show how this suburban culture has evolved. The two earliest patterns I showed you set the cultural assumptions. The two middle ones developed some of the economic mechanisms, such as hyping land sales, and the last three involved the federal government creating tax incentives for suburban real estate development. Citizens need a broad conversation about the appropriate relationship of government to the real estate industry and mortgage banking, if citizens are going to debate fair growth. And architects and landscape architects and planners also need to be part of that discussion in a really informed way. There's some wonderful new scholarship on suburbs coming out these days, or coming out soon. And I'd just like to wrap up by telling you some of the areas where younger scholars are at work, studying ethnic communities in suburbia in detail, looking at issues of suburbs and whiteness and the mechanisms of racial discrimination, understanding the transnational promotion of the American single-family suburb through various government programs to bring our sitcom suburbs to many nations overseas, thinking about suburbs in global perspective, which is one of Ann Forsyth's projects here, and finally the Cultures of the Suburbs International Research Network, which is building connections across many different countries for people who are studying suburbs in many different places and to some extent many different times. I will wrap up here. I'd love to have a little conversation with you and have some questions, and I hope that you will agree that once we can name some of these particular physical patterns and start to recognize them in our metropolitan regions, we will have a better grip on many of the larger issues about financing, energy, which are at the forefront of debate today, but often seem to be rather difficult ones to resolve. Thank you.
Some questions. I want to ask one quick one. If you take from as a point of departure where you came from partially, which is that there seems to be, a culture or spirit of demand for certain things, and I think you call them, the affordability of housing, a sense of community, and a connection to nature. And the question is, that I want to ask you is, given, a lot of dissatisfaction, critiques of suburbs, some people live in them, do chafe in them, some of them love them, what's the scope for design in terms of showing and demonstrating that you can create these sort of senses of privacy, connections to nature at greater densities, better connected to things, and that this could provide, a way of satisfying that demand that people would begin to gravitate to. Those who exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, kind of focusing on some of these issues. You probably know that I was involved with them. I'm curious your take on the design aspect of it.
Well, it's a tough question, and I think that architects have been largely excluded from a lot of the, and landscape architects too, have been excluded from a lot of suburban design since the time of the picturesque enclaves. And so there were moments when architects certainly tried to get back into this in the 1920s, and in Building Suburbia I talk about some of the architects' organizations that wanted a part of that suburban building business, how hard it was for them to deal with developers and people who were always trying to do a building a little bit more cheaply. I've also come across the battles of many urban planners in the 20s to try to shape the framework for better new communities, only to find that developers would complain that their ideas were too expensive too. Things like community parks and sidewalks and everything that would make a community more livable. And the potential of design to make inexpensive housing comfortable and to connect to the landscape, to make things really compact and beautiful, it's tremendous potential. But it's very, very difficult to see that as something that has an easy entry. But certainly New Urbanists have tried to promote the idea that with good design and good developers, you could turn this whole suburban situation around. But 20, 25 years later, we're seeing again, it's not about just having better design. It's not about having a more enlightened developer. There's a whole national network of government regulations, banking, and development interests that has been flourishing since the time of Herbert Hoover, and it's not easy to make a dent in. But I think when people, like the new urbanists, often made very effective polemics against the problem, they tended to blame traffic engineers. They didn't really blame developers. They certainly didn't blame government regulation. The history was mostly targeted to people who had something to do with making roads, and making roads too wide. That's not the heart of the problem. It's a piece of the problem. And certainly General Motors promoted automobiles to urban and suburban residents in ways that was not productive of better community design. But that's not where the whole problem is rooted, I would say.
I want to ask a question. I think there's a big shift in how people think about suburbs since 2007, 2008, when the real estate market collapsed. And then I started reading articles in Planning Magazine and elsewhere by the journalist Charles Marin. Suburbs are Ponzi schemes. Suburbs are Ponzi schemes because the tax rate doesn't include deferred maintenance, the cost of replacing water pipes, the cost of a new school. People buying in. It's what you alluded to really effectively, that people buying in with their dream don't understand the complexity of the economics underneath that's making their dream look feasible. So have you been seeing about the Ponzi scheme idea, the shift in how people think about suburbs since 2007-8?
Well, I don't think it's such a recent question. There were people who, back in the New Deal era, thought that you could build a town like Greenbelt. You build the community infrastructure, the school, the town center, the parks, and so forth. And that in the end, this would be a much more effective way to develop than just letting private developers build houses with maybe a minimal amount of space for the community, and then letting the taxpayer slowly try to pick up the costs of the rest, which would have been the case in Levittown. It was debated along political lines, and I think we're still debating, is it more expensive to build community infrastructure and then tie this to the construction of housing? Or is it better to simply build houses, let people buy houses, and then find out what the hidden costs are? And it's very difficult to push against development interests and real estate interests that would certainly find it easier to do a building project one bit at a time. But of course, that's the way it was back in the 19th century when one was thinking about how somebody like Samuel Gross was operating in his streetcar suburbs around Chicago. He was building as little infrastructure as possible. Yeah.
Where do you see the role of planning, codification, sort of tools that planners have in their toolkit to actually create this suburban route, right? So every development has to go through a subdivision approval and a land use change of some sort that then allows for the building to happen. Where in that sort of timeline do you see maybe potential for such a toolkit to evolve or change needs, or is that something that came after the developers have laid out the plan and the planners coming up through the subdivision and sort of rolls out across the country? So I'm just thinking that's like one component that maybe not necessarily designed, but the sort of judicial side of planning has in its toolkit to change some of this.
Yeah, there's no doubt that planners have a lot of tools, and architects have a lot of tools, and so do landscape architects. I guess that what often seems to happen, though, is that the real estate developers have the deepest pockets, and they have the greatest financial interest in being well ahead of citizens or professionals in most communities. And so if you want to think like a developer, you're looking around wondering where you might be able to do a deal, make some money, make a bigger project. And you're 10 years ahead of the people who are eventually going to look at these plans and say, oh no, we can't do that. It's really a tough one. And there's constant pressure, political pressure and economic pressure on people in localities, go along with what's being proposed as instead of having a better solution. and it's quite discouraging. I do believe that the more professionals and academics get involved in public debates about everything to do with planning and housing and the environment, the more people will feel confident that they can form some very substantial opinions about these matters, rather than thinking that it's some sort of very technical area and they couldn't possibly understand it. One reason I wrote the Field Guide to Sprawl was to give people a vocabulary to go to meetings and say, no, the reason we can't do that is X or Y. And I was very pleased when it got put on a high school geography syllabus, say, okay, that's fine, the 18-year-olds will really get this down. So there's just a lot, there's a lot more to do. Yeah.
I think things like that are really critical. I mean, my own town, no one on the planning board has any sort of design background or planning background, and I think it's fairly typical in suburban communities, contrasted with maybe larger cities or urban areas where there may be more of a design or planning emphasis. But a lot of the people that are responsible for making decisions or influenced by development don't have that background and are responding really to what's being presented to them in terms of what will help our town, right now, with jobs,
I live in a small town in Connecticut that was founded in 1639. It has a beautiful village green with a historic district around it. And about 5 or 6 years ago, people wanted to put a Costco 1 mile from this village green. It didn't happen. That's not to say it couldn't happen. The town had regulations about the size of big box stores that were nothing like what the Costco was proposing. But it was fascinating to watch how the people representing Costco worked. Real estate developers from Ohio just came into this town and started telling people it would be good for them. Fortunately, many local small business owners organized against it, along with many residents. And we had a lot of serious discussion about the meaning of the word scale. And happily, there was even somebody from Yale who teaches commercial real estate, and I approached him. He does actually work with shopping malls all the time, but when I said a Costco within a mile of the Village Green, he said, all right, let me see if I can help you. And, it was just a monster. But a lot of people had no idea about the relative sizes of things, and some people even thought maybe it was, they'd find it convenient to be able to drive to the Costco instead of the one that's now 30 miles away or something, like 15 or 30 miles away. So there's a lot of general, there's a need for a wake-up call for many people to say, what is it that you're proposing? And how do I understand it? How do I visualize it? How can I really see whether or not that's something good for this particular town? Yeah.
About 10 years ago, there was a big movement that you might have been part of the process going on, you didn't know, and the sprawl stuff, anti-sprawl stuff for the National Trust. But they were essentially within the Beltway voice that raises to a national level. And a lot of those institutions have been decimated now. Do you see anybody or any institution within the Beltway that could have a national focus like they did 10 years ago?
I'll focus on sprawl.
Because essentially, they were the people, your issue with Costco, they were doing with Walmart and Kmart in Vermont, New Hampshire, and it was front page news, it was all over and it was at least 10 years ago in the 90s for about a year or two before their funding got cut. But I just wondered if you see anybody inside the Beltway that would take that role now.
I think there's still a lot of people who are very concerned about sprawl and want to talk about it. And I think one of the problems with national organizations, of course, is that they can put together a toolkit, or they can, or even state organizations, but when it comes to the crunch, you're in some particular town. Maybe it's a suburb with 10, 20,000 people, and then maybe only, it's sometimes hard for the national organizations to really be effective in those local contexts, especially if the team of people coming in have spent 6 months becoming good friends with the mayor or the first selectman, or persuading them that there's some economic benefit for them. And I would say also that the other, that maybe some of the realtors organizations and the development organizations are actually better at organizing and reaching down into those towns than the big nonprofits who are against sprawl. I don't know what other people's experience might have been, but my sense is that they may offer better help on the development side than on the anti-sprawl side.
Oh yes, okay. I have 2 points. One is that a couple of weeks ago in mid-February, there was a lot of hoopla about the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And I thought that many of your slides showing the exteriors of those houses in the white communities could be illustrations for what was going on the inside of the houses that she wrote about in her text. Now, my other point is about the notable lack of sidewalks in some of those slides. There was one slide in particular, I don't know whether it was a photograph or a highly stylized rendering as lighted by a UFO and green light. There was a curb cut and a driveway for each house, but the lawn came down, in front of the house, came down to the curb. There was no sidewalk. So that led me to wonder, how could these communities of single-family houses, which were built for growing families, raising the baby boom, how could they not allow for sidewalks for all of these children to walk safely to and from school? And that leads me to my question. Can communities, including rural communities, not just suburban, but rural, that have no sidewalks, can they be retrofitted with sidewalks? Early on in the Obama administration, either President Obama or Michelle Obama was quoted in print in a reputable magazine, like Newsweek or something like that, as saying there's no government policy that can enable people to lose weight or to not be obese. And I thought, yes, there is, sidewalks and streetlights. And so that informs my question, can communities that lack sidewalks be retrofitted with sidewalks and streetlights?
Well, the answer to that, I think, is it depends. And you could also say that about bike lanes. It depends on the width of the streets, the connection to the center of town, the possibilities. Not all those communities that were the sitcom suburbs had sidewalks. Some of them did, some of them didn't. It depended a little bit on what the requirements might be in the political jurisdiction where something was being built. Lakewood, California, for example, was within Los Angeles County, and they required sidewalks, and they also required a planting strip between the sidewalk and the street. So they did considerably better than some builders who were working in unincorporated areas where there are no regulations.
I'll take one last question.
I don't think that the problem with this suburbia is the sidewalks. It's that I come from Florida, and we have thousands of sidewalks, and no one uses them. And people are still busy. I think the problem rises because of what the Urban Planning Association offers, as a way of knowledge to the cities. I just opened a book recently from the 2008, 2009 of the best practices of urbanization in Florida, and they just offer the typical neo-urbanism way of planning in these communities, where houses are all spread apart, where houses have nothing to do with the landscape. There's nothing to do around these communities. So I think there's that disconnection of knowledge between the urban planning and the actual cities that need to be reworked. It's there's a dysfunction of what is we are offering to them, or the planning association is offering to teach this community of how to urbanize. And in the meantime, if we don't offer anything else, these developers are going to still be doing this.
Well, I think again, it depends on what city you're in, what town you're in, what kinds of materials are being generated, good examples, bad examples, and it does vary a lot from place to place.
I'm going to take the prerogative and just say a couple of remarks, and then turn to thanking Dolores for coming. I think, the part of the challenge here is there's not really a natural constituency for density, which a lot of what this is about is density. And in fact, developers often have a lot of incentive to try to create it, but not enough to try to overcome the extent of a lot of local resistance that typically there is to it. And so given all the things that make the system run and it works in terms of capital ability to earn a return, your point, which I think you may have hammered a number of times, is really a great one, which is that if society wants to create enough incentives to create that kind of density and make it compelling, there's ways they can do that. Ways they can make flows of capital and credit to things that are less dense possible, but that's not the direction we've taken, and it's not clear who's going to stand up to try and see it done. But I thought, I'll give you a chance to last word, but I thought, I think we all would say this enormous, historical context, this sweep, seeing some of these strands going all the way back, and as you said, at some level the Borderlands have come back in a new kind of iteration, just puts it in a context that helps you understand the layers of the landscape that we see today, some of the reasons that we have them, but also the use of the complexity, if you want to do, as I think, use the word repair, try to reclaim a different kind of vision for what the landscape's going to look like, and just, the amount of work you've done over the years to help us all understand that has just been enormously valuable. The issues that people try to address are very complex, and we help them understand the complexity. So I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll clear.
Well, I guess one thing I would say about these repairs, and people have mentioned sidewalks and scale and other questions, we do still have some older suburban centers from the time when suburbs were either built around the railroad station or around a streetcar line, and so those have greater density already than the new kinds of things that are being built way out, with a big box store here and there. And so I think it is widely recognized that it's important to hold on to those suburban centers that have density and repair them if they are starting to have some problematic areas, rather than just let them go. Because if you let them go, then everything is going to be in the 2013 style, which will be favoring those other very automotive patterns over the pedestrian. And so that's, that's where I think it isn't glamorous work, it isn't exciting, it isn't that little project I showed in Irvington, it took years to get the funding for it, and people had to be tremendously committed to just weaving that small building together and back together, and keeping that link between the railroad station and the main street. So people who take on that kind of work have to know how complicated it's going to be. It's going to require the highest degree of skill, tremendous amount of patience, and design magazines will not be lining up to publish it as well.
So on that note of conservation and preservation, please join me in thanking Dolores for